Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into an incredible story about prophecy, a crisis of faith, and how a global religion was literally born from the ashes of what seemed like a complete and total failure. This isn't just some hypothetical question. It's the real, incredibly dramatic origin story of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We're talking about a faith that now has millions of followers, and it was all sparked by a single, very specific, and ultimately incorrect date. So our story kicks off way back in the 1830s. America was in the middle of a huge religious revival, and at the center of our story is a farmer, a Baptist farmer named William Miller. And he became absolutely convinced that he had unlocked a biblical timeline for the end of the world.
Miller got this date by poring over the book of Daniel, specifically something called the 2300-day prophecy. He and his followers, who became known as the Millerites, spread the word with this incredible urgency. Now, they did have an initial prediction for 1843 that, well, it came and went. But they just recalculated, dug deeper, and landed on a final, unshakable date, October 22nd, 1844. For them, this was it. This was everything.
Can you imagine? Believers had waited. Some had even sold their homes, quit their jobs, totally convinced this was the day. But the day came, the sun set, and nothing. The world just kept on spinning exactly as it had before. The silence must have been just deafening. And that moment, that crushing anticlimax, it got a name: the Great Disappointment. For most people, that was it. Game over. They scattered, totally disillusioned. But, and this is the important part, for a small, core group, the story wasn't finished. They just refused to believe that all that faith was for nothing. And that led them to ask this single, really radical question, a question that would change everything. It was the theological pivot, the one thing that saved this movement from just disappearing and actually set the stage for a brand new faith. So the very next day, a follower named Hiram Edson claimed to have a vision, and he proposed this idea. The prophecy was fulfilled on October 22nd, 1844. It just didn't happen on Earth. The idea was that instead of coming to Earth, Christ had entered a new phase of his work up in heaven, what they called a cleansing of the sanctuary. And that reinterpretation was the key. So out of the ashes of this great disappointment, three really important figures emerged. You had James White, who was the organizer, the publisher who gave the new movement structure. You had Joseph Bates, a former sea captain, who introduced the really crucial idea of a Saturday Sabbath. And then you had James's wife, Ellen G. White, whose prophetic visions gave divine guidance and really unified the scattered believers. Slowly but surely, these new ideas started coming together. And by 1863, almost 20 years after the disappointment, this new movement became official. It was organized as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and its name came from two of its most central beliefs: the Second Advent, or coming of Christ, and the Seventh-day Sabbath. Okay, so let's really dive into this worldview, because these core beliefs are what make the church so unique. And we're going to start with the one that's right there in the name. Right, so Joseph Bates brought this idea over from a group called the Seventh-day Baptists. For Adventists, observing the Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset isn't just a nice tradition. They see it as a binding moral law, straight from the Fourth Commandment, and it acts as a sign of loyalty to God. And this is a perfect example of Ellen White's role. She had a vision of the Ten Commandments up in heaven, and she said she saw a special halo of light glowing around the fourth one, the Sabbath commandment. And that vision really cemented the Sabbath as a central pillar of this new faith. Now, this is where you see a huge split from mainstream Christianity. Adventists believe that keeping a Saturday Sabbath is a command for all people for all time. Meanwhile, most other Christians view that specific command as part of the Old Covenant with Israel, and they worship on Sunday to celebrate Christ's resurrection. All right, so this next doctrine, it builds directly on that whole reinterpretation of the Great Disappointment. It's really the theological answer to the question, so what really happened in 1844? It's called the investigative judgment. And this is a doctrine you will only find in Adventism. The teaching is that starting in 1844,
Christ began a process in heaven of reviewing the lives and records of every single person who has ever claimed to be a believer. He's doing this to see if their faith was genuine, and this whole process has to finish before he can return. So here's the crucial point of difference. Historic Christianity teaches that Christ's sacrifice on the cross was it, a single finished event that paid for sin. Critics of the Adventist view argue that this doctrine of an ongoing investigation kind of compromises that finality. It suggests that salvation isn't fully assured just by faith, but also depends on the outcome of this heavenly review.
Okay, next up, we're going to look at a belief that really challenges a very, very common idea about what happens to us the moment we die. So Adventism completely rejects the idea of an immortal soul that zips off to heaven or hell right after death. Instead, they teach what's called soul sleep. The idea is that the dead are simply unconscious, asleep, really, waiting for the resurrection. They also believe that after the final judgment, the wicked won't be tortured forever, but will be completely annihilated. They'll just cease to exist. And again, you can see how this puts Adventist teaching in really sharp contrast with the historic Christian view. The traditional view holds that the soul is immortal and conscious after death, and that the punishment for those who are unrepentant is eternal and conscious. All right, finally, let's look at the foundational role of the co-founder, Ellen G. White. This remains one of the most distinctive and debated features of the Adventist faith. The church officially teaches that Ellen White had the biblical gift of prophecy. Her writings are extensive, volumes and volumes on theology, health, lifestyle, and they're considered divinely inspired. The way the church describes it is that her work is a lesser light, which is meant to point people to the greater light, which is the Bible. Now, this belief is a major, major departure from a core Protestant principle known as sola scriptura, which basically means scripture alone. That principle holds that the Bible is the one and only final authority. So in practice, Ellen White's writings function as the church's divinely inspired interpreter of that scripture. The story of the Seventh-day Adventist is just this powerful case study in resilience and reinterpretation. It shows how a group, faced with what looked like an absolute, undeniable failure, was able to forge a whole new identity, a totally unique theology, and a global movement right from the embers of that great disappointment. It really leaves us with this fascinating question about the power of belief, not just to get through a crisis, but to actually reshape reality itself.